Burnham.
Picard. This is a review/analysis of Season 1 of Star Trek Picard from CBS All Access. We are about to spoil everything. Everything. So, if you haven't seen it, then go away? Star Trek Picard is exactly the kind of thing we're hoping for back when Star Trek Discovery was first announced. A continuation of where we left off with Star Trek Voyager back in 2001. So many questions lingered from that great age of Trek in the 1990s. Did Dr. Crusher and Picard ever get together? Does Geordi LaForge ever get his own command? Did Captain Sisko ever return from his sojourn with the Prophets? Has Bajor finally entered the Federation? Whatever happened to those Janeway Paris salamander babies? So many questions. Shall we begin? From the very start, there was much to love in this new series, starting with the opening scene of Picard and Data playing poker aboard their old ship, a perfect way to start this particular story. The opening tune, Blue Skies, sung by Bing Crosby, who is the grandfather of Denise Crosby, helps to set just the right tone. This tune was used as a bit of a joke in 2002's Star Trek Nemesis, but now it's a calling card for those we miss, for better times.
When you're in love, my how they fly, oh blue skies, smiling at me.
In this and in other ways, Star Trek Picard Season 1 makes Star Trek Nemesis a better film. The pilot episode, Remembrance, is one of the better pilots of the whole franchise, and it is a promising start to this story.
I had a dear friend, Commander Data. He was an android.
Like the ones who attacked Mars?
No, not at all.
Visually, the show looks incredible. Just incredible. With seamless visual effects and complex cinematic-looking imagery. It certainly makes the source material look like a relic of the past.
Influences.
Thank you, Mr. Data.
You are welcome, sir.
We have nothing but love for how the final imagery feels. A kudos we extend to Star Trek Discovery as well. When characters visit strange new worlds in this newest era of Trek, they really finally do. Versus, well, Cave Planet number 47. And Earth/Starfleet of this time period certainly feels updated with its faster transporters and its holographic computer workstations. And the performances are generally stellar. Patrick Stewart can read the back of a mayonnaise label and make it seem dramatic. Many of the other actors give us convincing work as well. And the Romulans. Oh, the Romulans. If you like this Star Trek race of beings, then there's some joy to seeing their species and culture expanded. Gone is the flat, monocultural representation.
Romulans. They're so predictably treacherous.
Now we have Romulans who are refugees, Romulans who are space ninjas, Romulans who are profiting from dismantling Borg drones. There are, it seems, more than one Romulan phenotype too. This is a lovely touch. Did I mention the space ninjas? And importantly, we get an update on the situation after the Romulan star went supernova, mentioned in the 2009 film Star Trek. This is all a lot of us wanted, ever since Star Trek Discovery was first announced several years ago, to pick up where we left off. And we do. So that's nice. Perhaps the most important update to the Romulans is that of ZHABAN and LARIS, Picard's doting housekeepers. In a franchise where Romulans are constantly duplicitous, constantly to be second-guessed, never to be trusted, it is refreshing to have a pair of Romulans, played very well by Orla Brady and Jamie McShane, that offer a new turn, a contrast that trends towards complexity, something Romulans have desperately needed since their first appearance. These two characters were a joy. Speaking of picking up where we left off, all else about this season aside, if the only thing we got to see was the episode Nepenthe, where Picard visits Riker and Troy, then the whole of the first season would have been worth the effort. This is exactly the thing for which we were all waiting. Exactly the payoff we were too scared to admit to hoping for. When the three of them, Will, Deanna, and Jean-Luc, were all sitting at the dinner table problem-solving together, well, as a fan, that felt like a little slice of home. It was perfect. And Kestra is exactly the child you'd think that Riker and Troy would have. She's great. And while some may dislike the weird extended family of Dr. Noonien Soong, it rather felt spot on in a story about androids that might be related to Data. We even get to meet an organic brother, which is nice. Data's family is almost as weird and melodramatic as Spock's family. It is a Star Trek tradition at this point, and it added a little flair of normalcy in this opening season of Picard. The show starts out very strongly, trumpeting several themes: legacy, mortality, standing up when it counts, even when others attack you for doing so. Several dramatic questions push in the direction of those themes. How does a great and prideful man like Jean-Luc Picard deal with the indignity of old age? What makes us human? What counts as a real life? It was interesting to see Picard so hampered by his wounded pride. As a viewer, I've often wondered what toll being a starship captain would take on Jean-Luc. When you are married to your job that hard, so hard that it crowds out your personal life, what does that look like when you are retired? However, the show muddled those themes, like when Picard's death ended up not being so permanent, which takes the theme of standing up for what is right and bumps it right into the theme of what it means to be human. And, well, it didn't really mix all that well. They overshadowed each other in all the wrong ways. Overall, if I had to summarize this season into one word, that word would be imbalanced. Season 1 aimed high, and it met some of its goals. But many of its goals weren't met. I think this comes down to a philosophy of production, behind the scenes, to the style of story to which the showrunners have committed themselves. Let me show you what I mean. The primary sins of Star Trek Picard come down, overall, to how it was delivered, to the style that was used. But perhaps more specifically, the most imbalanced bits come down to the writing and story structure, which may have suffered in order to implement that style. That imbalance is the source of several key issues throughout the season. For example, the way they've chosen to tell this story pushes the narrative so that it feels rushed in many places. So much so that there are several unanswered questions. Like, what happened to Narek? Was he arrested? Did he change sides? Is he dead? And why are some of Picard's decisions seemingly so bad? Like in this scene, after Picard talks Seven out of killing B'Jaizel, he lets her beam back down fully armed only minutes later. It's then that Seven continues on her rampage. What does Picard think will happen when he lets Seven have those weapons? Isn't he smarter than this?
Murder is not justice. There is no solace in revenge.
The story is moving so fast that we don't have time to ponder why he let her go back down to the planet armed. And why was Soji sent to the Borg cube? Why was Dahj sent to infiltrate the Daystrom Institute? What were they supposed to find out? Who was the mom woman talking to Dahj and Soji? Clearly not their mother, but maybe software? Why did she direct Dahj towards Picard and not do the same for Soji? Why was it important for Dahj and Soji to think that they were human, when their brothers and sisters on Coppelius knew fully that they were artificial? Why didn't Lore factor into this somewhere? Isn't he in a drawer at Daystrom, just like B4? And what's the explanation for the Zhat Vash, who have presumably existed for centuries, having not gone after Data back when he was creating Lal? And how did the Federation lift the synth ban in the last episode? It happened so quickly. Shouldn't there have been some discussion, especially after a bunch of evil mechanical centipedes tried to climb out of a wormhole to kill all organic life in the galaxy? Isn't the Federation, right to continue the ban in order to avoid death by evil robot centipede? Isn't the secret Romulan Zhat Vash, don't they have a point? At the very least, the story should have addressed this. And there are many actions that have no apparent consequences. For example, why didn't Will Riker arrest Commodore O during the standoff above Coppelius? She was presumably outed as a spy who had been working for Starfleet, right? Shouldn't there be a consequence for her subterfuge? And what about Dr. Girardi's murder of Bruce Maddox? Even if she could claim temporary insanity, shouldn't there, still be a hearing or something?
My status, my right to choose. Well, seems reasonably self-aware to me, Commander.
I mean, when it comes to android-related matters, this franchise loves its hearings. Other character choices feel inorganic. Why, por ejemplo, did we need to meet Raffi's son to know that she has a troubled past and a broken family? We breeze past that whole moment so quickly, it seems almost inconsequential to building the character of Raffi. A simple line of dialogue could have saved the whole production a shoot day and the cost of hiring those actors. The most inorganic character choice is evident with the main character Picard in the last episode. The dramatic tension of Picard's transformation into a machine just wasn't fully explored. It went unexplored because the story didn't let itself have time to talk about it. You see, Picard is a man who championed android rights all of his life.
They're living, sentient beings. Their rights and privileges in our society have been defined. I helped define them.
And who, contrastingly, was assimilated against his will by the Borg, a moment when his humanity was seemingly ripped out of him. Why wasn't the tension between those two diametrically opposed, contradictory, fundamentally Picard experiences explored in this scene here? Instead, Picard is happy that he is alive, but almost nonchalant about the sudden change in his state of being. The man just lost every bit of his humanity. He should be in an outright existential crisis, complicated by his advocacy for synth rights and his experience with the Borg. But we get none of that. For anyone who knows this character, this whole situation with the birth of Synth Picard feels inorganic and forced. Like writers and executive producers were more interested in the structure of the death fake-out than whether it makes a kind of poetic, terrifying sense for Picard to become the very thing he fought to protect in the very same manner in which he was assimilated. Season 2 of Picard would be wise to spend the entire story exploring this dimension. Additionally, there were story elements that felt like wasted space. Did we need Seven to be in this? Or Space Legolas? And Raffi? Or an entire Borg ship? I mean, it looked cool, but why was it even there? Take those characters and elements out, and does the main story still function? It would seem so. While it was very nice to see Jeri Ryan again, if you remove Seven from the story, it does not appear that much is affected. Same goes for Space Legolas, who was fun and interesting on paper, but didn't really do much to advance Picard's predicament or advance the larger story. Losing Seven and Elnor means we could have skipped some odd, misshapen episodes, like this one, which didn't really fit in anywhere. Picard connects up with Raffi in order to get access to a pilot, a function that could have been handed off to Picard's old Stargazer doctor, Dr. Moritz Banyun. And why did Hugh die again? Is it Picard's fault that he was killed? Shouldn't Picard be remorseful? There were also a variety of world-building sins which contradict previous Star Trek incarnations. Let's start with the economics of Star Trek. At best, we can surmise that the world of Star Trek is a proto-post-scarcity economic system, explained in delightful detail by author Rick Webb in his Medium article now book, The Economics of Star Trek. Or maybe it has something to do with the economics of personal reputation becoming the primary currency in society. Regardless, the Earth of Star Trek is a place where money might as well not matter, where technology can easily and cheaply produce whatever personal goods and food that is needed. Star Trek seems to describe the kind of economic system that either capitalism or democratic socialism might grow into. Except, and this is key, Star Trek is almost explicitly vague about how this new kind of economics comes into being. Why tie the franchise to a particular economic system or philosophy of governance contemporary to the audience's real-world experience when that will only lead to division and alienation among fans? Trust me, CBS wants your socialist dollars alongside your capitalist ones. Besides, the writers don't know what the real future holds. All they were simply trying to say with the world of Star Trek is that the world simply gets better, and that we earn our way to that better life. Except that it doesn't get better. In this future, Raffi is poor. There also seems to be a working class, too, that gets stuck with bad scheduling. Poverty is a real thing that can happen to people on Earth in the late 24th century, which doesn't seem to gel with the paradise that humanity supposedly created for itself. Raffi chastises Picard for hiding away on his chateau. while she is ostracized out of Starfleet and left to remain at her humble trailer at Vasquez Rocks. This recontextualizes several things. First, it indicates that the Los Angeles County Department of Parks and Recreation, which runs Vasquez Rocks, is letting people live in the park in the 24th century. That's nice. But seriously, this tells us that Earth isn't some kind of paradise after all. That the economic Gilded Age-style problems that plague Earth in our own 21st century will plague Earth in the future also. It also remakes Starfleet, the organization dedicated to exploration and to defending the Federation. Previously, Starfleet felt like a representative of Earth, as an example of how things are back home, of the successful strides that humanity took to make life better. Now, just with the knowledge that economic disparity could not be curtailed back home, Starfleet seems more like a special, isolated case. Like how the US Army is sort of a mini-socialist state that runs counter to the grain of the larger capitalist US empire. Like a secular Salvation Army that has teeth, and a fixation on repeating the Lewis and Clark expedition. Or maybe Picard and Raffi exist in an economic system where reputation is more important than actual currency. If so, then why didn't the show address this? Another thing to be discussed in this vein is Raffi's drug addiction and alcoholism. Isn't that substance dependence, which is a disease? And as such, with all the whiz-bang gadgets and the newfangled technologies of the 24th century, isn't addiction a treatable, even a curable disorder? And while Star Trek is often the source of some quite magical technologies, warp drive and energy shields come to mind, Saga's tool, which Picard and Jurati use in the final battle, is inconsistent even with Trek's magical track record. It can repair the La Sarina's intermix chamber and trick an entire Romulan fleet.
There's no kind of trigger or switch.
Are we sure this device wasn't supposed to be John Delancey playing the character of Q? And one more thing about world building, or rather about the themes going on in the background. Isn't it weird how Raffi, played by the lone African-American actress on the cast, is the one person addicted to drugs in the story? Isn't that a tired trope by now? Or how Jean-Luc Picard, the alpha white male leading character, is, by the end of the show, transformed into a member of a persecuted minority. It's a bit like Avatar, or Dances with Wolves or something. It's understandable how these weren't intentional decisions, but that the circumstances of the story allowed for them to happen shows a lack of forethought. Or at the very least, a missed opportunity to engage with the very reasons why these tropes should be handled with care. Regardless, no matter what kind of story you're trying to tell, the key is in the delivery of it. So let's examine the delivery of this show, this story, and see how it stacks up. In terms of the delivery or the presentation, there are several elements that detract from the overall emotions that showrunners want you to feel. For one, the show is consistently overscored, even if the score is very lovely, which it is. The effect steps on the performances of actors in multiple scenes. An example of this can be found in the pilot, during the interview between the reporter and Picard.
Well, today is a solemn day.
It is a day of memories.
You can see Patrick Stewart responding to questions as if the reporter is delivering blows. You can see him squirming in his chair. You can see the satisfaction on the reporter's face when she lands one of those blows. All of this is evident with performances and camera work alone. But the score here feels like too much, like it's echoing too hard what we're already seeing on screen. It dials the whole scene up to 11, which dulls us to the actual high-intensity scenes further in the story, the ones with the explosions and murder and such. This interview scene should have played with little to no underlying score. It might have, ironically, made the whole moment more tense by allowing our attention to linger solely on the performances and on the reaction shots from ZHABAN and LARIS.
Why did you really quit Starfleet?
Because it was no longer Starfleet.
I'm sorry?
Because it was no longer Starfleet.
But that's not to say that the actual score itself isn't great. It is. Or that it isn't well placed in other scenes, like this one. This scene is more emotionally intense than the interview. It is a fateful meeting that sets the whole adventure in motion. But scoring like this for every scene dulls the senses and works counter to the experience that the filmmakers want to impart to the audience. sometimes silence is an effective score by itself. The show repeatedly and blatantly smashes the nostalgia button, too, on scoring, and in general, like when we hear the Star Trek Voyager theme every time we meet Seven on screen, or when Picard delivers to us some nostalgic line. That being said, doing that kind of thing once can be very effective, like how this old Romulan theme was reconfigured from a classic Trek episode for this introduction to the Romulan-controlled Borg cube. Although hitting the nostalgia button does work sometimes, like the very opening scene of the pilot with Data and Picard playing poker in 10 Forward aboard the old Enterprise D. That was a good moment for some nostalgia. But doing it repeatedly can be exhausting. Yes, we know who these characters are. That's why we're here. Camera movement on the show is very much like that of its predecessor, Star Trek Discovery. It is dialed into a specific formula of action-adventure visual storytelling. Specific instances felt fine and lined up with what characters are saying and doing, with how the audience is meant to be feeling. Like in the opening dream sequence of the pilot episode. Right when Picard's dream begins to turn upside down, so does the camera. The camera and the story are speaking in unison. But more often, the camera craft, like the score, drowned out actor performances and ran over top of other artistic ingredients. For example, in this scene of Picard and Soji talking about Data, the camera is in constant motion, with no variation, no start or finish. It doesn't seem to be connected to what the characters are feeling, but instead seem to be connected to a specific visual style to which the show is aiming, irrespective of character. We see the same thing in Star Trek Discovery, in scenes like this one where the camera seems to be flying around the room during a simple staff meeting. Now, context is everything, and you may well be saying, aren't you taking this specific camera move out of context? That is possible, and it is important to note that despite all the money flying around, $8 to $9 million per episode for Picard, that this is an art form that is a completely subjective experience. But all the same, let's consider an example from previously in the franchise, from a Next Generation episode called Ensign Ro. In this episode, we get a moment where the character Ro Laren is coming clean to Captain Picard, and in that moment, she spills her guts on the reasonings behind her actions, which is a very personal admission for her. What does the camera do? It spends about 90 seconds slowly getting closer and closer to Ro as her admission gets more and more personal. It keeps this up until the camera is in a close-up on Ro, just as her deepest truth is revealed.
I don't want to be ashamed of my heritage any longer, Captain.
The camera move is perfectly matched to the emotion and action of the scene. It is so subtle that you don't notice what the camera's doing because you're too busy feeling the emotion of the scene, the emotion of the performance. Camera and performance are speaking in unison. The camera's goal is the same as the speech. You are getting closer to Ro as a person, literally. That's cinematic. Star Trek Picard and its cousin Star Trek Discovery don't have a lot of that kind of subtlety by design. We'll get back to the idea that Picard and Discovery share the same style of camera work, and how they seem to share the same style of storytelling as well. But first, let's imagine what the first season of Star Trek Picard might look like if we changed a few of the decisions on story. Many of the story ingredients of Picard's first season could have worked, especially if we remove some of the unnecessaries. But let's go one step further. If we reorganized the story a little, could we have made the whole thing a better experience? What if, for example, we start with Picard's death? Right up in the opening episode, Picard dies and his mind is uploaded to an android without his consent. Given, as we have discussed a few moments ago, that Picard has been a champion of android rights since his friendship with Data, his transformation into an actual android makes a kind of poetic sense. He has become the very thing he sought to protect all of his life, but instead, his protected privilege as an organic being is removed. Suddenly, the synth ban applies directly to him. And given his inhuman experience with the Borg, in which he was assimilated against his will, in which his body was riddled with cold, intrusive technologies, suddenly waking up as an android should stir some difficult PTSD-style memories. He was robbed of his humanity, and without his consent. Any of us would have a difficult time with that. From a starting point such as this, Picard could have spent all of Season 1 searching out Soji and fighting the synth ban in an effort to rediscover his own lost humanity. The story practically writes itself, and it is a very sci-fi kind of story too. The evil mustache-twirling, weirdly sexualized Romulan villains are par for the course for Star Trek, which is to say poor. The franchise is notorious for giving life to terrible villains. The motivations of these new villains don't make much sense, except as a kind of Romulan Luddite movement, which is never really discussed beyond their need to kill sentient tech. Perhaps a better use of villainy here would be a simple Romulan plot to grab control of synthetics to hurt the Federation, as a matter of vengeance for the Federation's failure to help the Romulan people when their sun went supernova. But then why would they stage a synth revolt on Mars when their own species faced extinction? Indeed, that question applies as strongly to the Zhat Vash in the official Season 1 story. The Zhat Vash struck out against Mars using synthetics, while the bulk of the Romulan population needed to be rescued. If their goal was to save lives, then why didn't they? Jay Manning of the Classic Flicks YouTube channel suggests some other, smaller changes that might result in a better story overall, using the very same elements we saw in the first season. Put Dahj's call to her mom before she meets Picard, instead of having her track down Picard twice. Have Data's paintings both at Picard's house. The only reason they are kept at a virtual storage unit is so Dahj can track him there. Picard's realization of the painting's meaning can still happen without the extra scene. Casual bigotry among Federation citizens is silly. It would make for better dramatic tension if we saw the synths being actually accepted by the workers. Trust in the synths makes the betrayal a bigger deal. Having the humans hate the synths already gives the audience a sense that they had it coming. In Dahj's apartment, LARIS' use of molecular re-imaging is unnecessary. Just have them go through Dahj's computer records. If there was a murder or a missing person on Earth, why isn't it breaking news? Why aren't the authorities looking for Soji? Let us know that drastic actions have drastic consequences. Should Dahj be a suspect in her boyfriend's murder? Yes, she should. Don't take a cab to Rafi's. Cab should not be a thing. Transport there. Picard should be instantly suspicious of Dr. Jurati when she shows up demanding to go on the adventure with him, because an attentive audience is suspicious of her. Waiting for the characters to play catch-up with the audience can ruin tension. Don't send Picard on the secret space pirate mission. He's famous. Like, really famous. You would recognize President Barack Obama if he were acting like a silly space pirate, wouldn't you? During the humanity dialogue exchange between Seven and Picard, have Picard blow cover and beam down to Seven to talk her out of it. Then have the dialogue about their remaining humanity. That's when an exchange like that should be had, when the stakes are high. Have Maddox die from his injuries. Don't make Dr. Jurati a cold-blooded murderer, especially after an intimate relationship with Maddox. Rafi's call to Starfleet should have raised some red flags. After Soji scans everything she owns to determine the ages of the items, she should have scanned herself. The episode Nepenthe should have been 2 episodes. 1 episode with the Troy Rikers, and 1 with the La Serena family. Everything should have been given more room to breathe. Give Soji and Castra time to bond over their shared loss. Let the old crewmates take the time to sit around the conference table and hash out an answer. Let the La Serena crew have the time to bond over their shared situation. Make it a rescue mission for Space Legolas and Hugh. Have Hugh stay behind to cover his escape, this time. Let Hugh die for something and not just get killed because he was in the way. As it stands, Hugh should still be alive. And finally, let Soji have just a moment with Data in the simulation, in the final episode. Having father, of sorts, meet daughter, of sorts, would have expanded on the conversation that Soji and Picard were having about Data. Now, Soji can see for herself what kind of person Data was. This may have been Picard's scene, his goodbye to Data, the end of that relationship. But every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, right? In organizing this review, the most overriding evident element is that the story is being subverted in order to fit into a particular formula of storytelling. And this seems to be the case for Star Trek Discovery as well. Let's compare those shows, Picard and Discovery, alongside the newer Kelvin timeline films, and to the larger entertainment industry as a whole, to see if we can suss out or understand the storytelling philosophy that is animating Alex Kurtzman's era of Star Trek. Now that we have Discovery, Picard, and the Kelvin timeline films in this new era of Star Trek to examine and compare to each other, we are seeing many of the same motifs. For example, the repeated consistent use of nostalgia for older shows and moments. The newer shows do use the more salient moments from earlier in the franchise to buttress story decisions and character motivations, but more often than not, we are seeing the use of nostalgia just for the sake of nostalgia. Another motif present in this modern era of Star Trek is the over-the-top stakes found in the stories of each of these new Treks. In the 2009 film Star Trek, a Romulan superweapon is used to first destroy the planet Vulcan, and then turned toward Earth to try to destroy that planet. This superweapon is depicted as a menacing beam of energy puncturing through the planet's crust and mantle to explode the core. Star Trek Into Darkness features a secret Starfleet division, Section 31, hellbent on attacking the Klingon Empire, which would have likely led to a crushing and dispiriting war. An entire starship crashes spectacularly into San Francisco in this movie. Star Trek Beyond features another Starfleet-turned bad guy, Balthazar Edison, who decides to attack the Federation for, essentially, turning against his personal values of who should be the enemy. In all three cases, the Federation, and Earth in particular, is threatened with high-stakes destruction, most often from Federation citizens and Starfleet personnel. Discovery's first season involved a misuse of the mycelial network in the Terran Imperial universe, which could have led to the destruction of all life everywhere in the multiverse. Discovery's second season involved an AI computer system called Control, taking actions to fulfill its mandate that would have seen an eventual destruction of Starfleet, the Federation, and all life in the galaxy. And Picard Season 1 conveniently also involved an AI threat that would have seen all life in the galaxy exterminated. In each case, high-powered beams of energy erupting through space, or giant superweapons, or swarms of small hive-mind-connected ships, or a general AI threat, each incarnation involves apocalyptic stakes, almost copied from each other. Contrast that to an episode like The Next Generation's Darmok, where the stakes are life and death for only two men, and the whole story turns on those two men having to make a connection to each other through a confusing language barrier. Or DS9's The Sound of Her Voice, a touching story with a sci-fi twist that takes place through characters being alone in their rooms, talking to a disembodied voice. The story resolves without much end-of-the-world doom. Star Trek does often turn toward apocalyptic stakes.
Bones is a thing out there.
Why is any object we don't understand always called a thing?
But like the high levels of weaponized nostalgia, it's the concentration of stories involving the destruction of everything in this new era of Trek that is the issue. You can get numb to it being used over and over in such quick succession. In the Abrams-Kurtzman style of storytelling, those personal stakes are drowned out with exploding planets and giant robot centipedes as a matter of style. Another motif that seems to define this era of Star Trek is the death fake-out. You know, when a beloved character dies and then comes back to life again in the same story. Captain Kirk died and was resurrected in Star Trek Into Darkness. Discovery's Season 2 involved a death fake-out for Saru, and then Michael Burnham. And at the end of Star Trek Picard, we get a death fake-out for Picard himself. Sort of. I guess he technically died. I can hear you saying, well, they did this way back in 1984 with Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. And yeah, you'd be right. But as with the continued use of apocalyptic stakes, the increased use of death fake-outs seems to be on the checklist for the Abrams-Kurtzman style of filmmaking. But perhaps the most hallmarkish element in this philosophy of storytelling are the setups which feel most contrived. By that, we mean the blatant organizing of the plot so that a specific X or Y will happen. The more offensive versions of these can feel inorganic, such as Michael Burnham being Spock's sister, Captain Rios' connection to the androids of Coppelius, the magic triple blood of Star Trek Into Darkness that revives Captain Kirk, the convenience of having the Enterprise break down to allow Captain Pike to command Discovery, etc. Again, this is not a matter of having to design the plot for specific moments in and of itself, which has to happen in storytelling generally. Instead, a contrived plot element is one that doesn't feel natural, that feels inorganic to the story. It is the writer's job to make that design feel natural. The thing to note here, just like the continued use of nostalgia and the apocalyptic stakes, is the amount of contrived plot design going on in recent Star Trek, and how that seems to be a crucial element of the Abrams-Kurtzman era. The story is rushing by so quickly that there isn't time to make the story feel organic everywhere. Instead of letting the story breathe, of letting characters and their excellent actors feel the consequences of their actions, instead of setting the pieces in motion and letting the game play out, much of the story is engineered so that we get specific moments, prearranged. And oftentimes that engineering is designed to include big nostalgic elements, like with Seven's inclusion in Star Trek Picard, which again doesn't feel needed in Picard's journey. It was contrived to include some nostalgia for Star Trek Voyager, and it does not fit in organically. So why are these elements so consistent across all the newer incarnations of Star Trek? Can't really say for certain, but we can speculate as to why this particular design is animating the current version of Star Trek. But our best bet lies with the idea that Star Trek is being reconfigured to compete with the new Star Wars films, but especially to compete with the new Marvel films of the last decade. Marvel has been the unprecedented champion of filmmaking over the last decade, raking in billions upon billions of dollars worldwide. And Marvel's success story has left other studios racked with jealousy. Studios are, naturally, desirous to compete, to make the kind of money that Marvel is making. What franchises have they got collecting dust somewhere that can be rebooted? How can they get a piece of this new movie pie? For Paramount, Star Trek qualified as a popular franchise that can be retooled to get a piece of that Marvel action. The 2009 Star Trek film felt like a fresh start and a chance at capitalizing on the promise of Marvel levels of money. And you know something? It's not the first time that this has happened. In 1979, Star Trek was resurrected to grab a piece of that sweet Star Wars action. Star Wars had exploded on the scene in 1977, to the surprise of everyone, including George Lucas. So Star Trek was reimagined and pressed into service to compete in the new emerging blockbuster landscape. And then there's that whole thing about Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine copying notes from each other in the 1990s. I offer no opinion on that. But in the here and now, it isn't just franchise building that is the aim here. Much else is borrowed from the current filmmaking zeitgeist in order to steal some of the Marvel thunder. Similar story styles exist between the massively popular Marvel franchise and that of the recent Star Trek adventures. Similar world-ending stakes, similar levels of scoring, similar engineered plot contrivances for the sake of including fan service and pangs of nostalgia. There are even similar camera moves. Take this scene here, which matches the kind of thing we see in the first season of Picard. Just amorphous movement, no connection to the emotions of the scene. Marvel even does the death fake-out on occasion. Again, we are only speculating here, but perhaps this aim to fit Star Trek into the movie paradigm of the moment all leads to a particular style of action-adventure filmmaking, which is being executed almost at the expense of the things that made Star Trek what it is. Back when the J.J. Abrams Star Trek films were first being released, many fans were turned off, citing that the sci-fi-ness was turned down, that the sometimes smaller stakes of the television series often produced better stories overall, and that all of the Star Trek films, generally speaking, were not as strong as small-screen Trek. End-of-the-world stakes in action-adventure storytelling doesn't work every time for the Star Trek franchise, as evident by the old Star Wars versus Star Trek debates of yesteryear. But the irony of the moment is that Star Trek is back on the small screen, and in a big way, but that it's borrowing all the cinematic trappings of the most popular action-adventure films of our day, instead of borrowing from very cinematic streaming series like The Terror, The Plot Against America, Breaking Bad, or even the retooled Lost in Space on Netflix, a series that knows exactly what it is and is perfectly executed with cinematic flair. However, whether or not you are enjoying this new incarnation of Star Trek, or especially if you are not, do not fret too much. It is only a matter of time before this shape-shifting franchise changes form again and becomes another kind of Trek. The only thing that has been consistent across 50+ years of this franchise is that things never stay the same. Hello, it's me, the voice. Just wanted to say thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of this review. But I also wanted to let you know that we here at Trekspertise would like to do more. More essays and reviews and all of that. But in order to do that, we need your help. Plain and simple, it takes money to make this channel happen. Dollars and cents. To buy the digital tools, to purchase music, to hire technical expertise, to do the research and the editing. If you find any value in the topics being discussed here, in understanding where toxic fandom might come from, and how the Star Trek franchise talks about personhood or parenthood, or how it echoes ancient literature, and how science fiction connects with our modern lives, or how sci-fi films take a particular form, then consider supporting what we do here. Help us create more Trekspertise. You can do so by visiting us on Patreon. How much do you give? Well, that's up to you. Every little bit helps. The average monthly donation seems to be between $1 and $3, but it can get you more videos at a regular interval. You know that's what you want. So consider supporting us. Help us make Trekspertise the corner of the web for science fiction analysis. Link is in the subspace below. Finally, we'd like to thank our patrons who make this whole thing possible, starting with Hank S., or Hank Augustus Iaponius Saturninus. Haukur Guðmundsson? Boy, I think I butchered your name. I'm so sorry. Philippa Woods? Thank you, Philippa. Alex Absher. Thanks, Alex. Troy Bernier. I think I'm mispronouncing your name too, Troy. Boy, I'm terrible at this. Alex Blocker. Can't forget Mr. Blocker. And Cullen McArthur Jackson. Yeah, you're the bomb. And thank you to everybody else who is helping to make this channel a reality. It's very much appreciated. If you'd like to be notified when the next essay lands, then subscribe, turn on notifications, and especially sign up for our no-nonsense email list. The email list is the most efficient method. Again, you can find all of the relevant links in the subspace below. Thanks. See you soon. If you're looking to get more commentary and review on Star Trek Picard's first season, then may we suggest Classic Flicks' review here. Classic Flicks is a YouTube channel that reviews movies and science fiction, run by Jay Manning, who is a contributor to Trekspertise.
Noticing the days hurrying by when you're 遠い将来を考えてみようよ。